Section 2. The Romance of Machinery. I have repeatedly asked the reader to remember that my general view of our potential future divides itself into two parts. First, there is the policy of reversing, or even merely of resisting, the modern tendency to monopoly or the concentration of capital. Let it be noted that this is a policy because it is a direction, if pursued in any degree. In one sense, indeed, he who is not with us is against us, because if that tendency is not resisted, it will prevail. But in another sense, anyone who resists it at all is with us, even if he would not go so far in a reversal as we should. In trying to reverse the concentration at all, he is helping us to do what nobody has done yet. He will be setting himself against the trend of his age, or at least of recent ages. And a man can work in our direction, instead of the existing and contrary direction, even with the existing and perhaps contrary machinery. Even while we remain industrial, we can work towards industrial distribution and away from industrial monopoly. Even while we live in townhouses, we can own townhouses. Even while we are a nation of shopkeepers, we can try to own our shops. Even while we are the workshop of the world, we can try to own our tools. Even if our town is covered with advertisements, it can be covered with different advertisements. If the mark of our whole society is the trademark, it need not be the same trademark. In short, there is a perfectly tenable and practicable policy of resisting mercantile monopoly even in a mercantile state. And we say that a great many people ought to support us in that, who may not agree with our ultimate ideal of a state that should not be mercantile, or rather a state that should not be entirely mercantile. We cannot call on England as a nation of peasants, as France or Serbia is a nation of peasants. But we can call on England, that has been a nation of shopkeepers, to resist being turned into one big Yankee store. That is why, in beginning here the discussion of machinery, I pointed out first that in the ultimate sense we are free to destroy machinery, and second, that in the immediate sense it is possible to divide the ownership of machinery. And I should say myself that even in a healthy state there would be some ownership of machinery to divide. But when we come to consider this larger test, we must say something about the definition of machinery, and even the ideal of machinery. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy with what I may call the sentimental argument for machinery. Of all the critics who have rebuked us, the man I like best is the engineer who says, "But I do like machinery, just as you like mythology. Why should I have my toys taken away any more than you?" And of the various positions that I have to meet, I will begin with his. Now, on a previous page, I said I agree with Mr. Penty that it would be a human right to abandon machinery altogether. I will add here that I do not agree with Mr. Penty in thinking machinery like magic, a mere malignant power or origin of evils. It seems to me quite as materialistic to be damned by a machine as saved by a machine. It seems to me quite as idolatrous to blaspheme it as to worship it. But even supposing that somebody, without worshipping it, is yet enjoying it imaginatively, and in some sense mystically, the case, as we stated, still stands. Nobody would be more really unsuitable to the machine age than a man who really admired machines. The modern system presupposes people who will take mechanism mechanically, not people who will take it mystically. An amusing story might be written about a poet who was really appreciative of the fairy tales of science, and who found himself more of an obstacle in the scientific civilization than if he had delayed it by telling the fairy tales of infancy. Suppose whenever he went to the telephone, bowing 3 times as he approached the shrine of the disembodied oracle, and murmuring some appropriate form of words, such as vox et praetoria nil, he were to act as if he really valued the significance of the instrument. Suppose he were to fall into a trembling ecstasy on hearing from a distant exchange the voice of an unknown young woman in a remote town, were to linger upon the very real wonder of that momentary meeting in mid-air with a human spirit whom he would never see on earth, were to speculate on her life and personality, so real and yet so remote from his own, were to pause, to ask a few personal questions about her, just sufficient to accentuate her human strangeness, were to ask whether she also had not some sense of this weird psychical tete-a-tete, created and dissolved in an instant, whether she also thought of those unthinkable leagues of valley and forest that lay between the moving mouth and the listening ear. Suppose, in short, he were to say all this to the lady at the exchange, who was just about to put him on to 666 upper tooting. He would be really and truly expressing the sentiment, wonderful thing, the telephone, and unlike the thousands who say it, he would actually mean it. He would be really and truly justifying the great scientific discoveries and doing honour to the great scientific inventors. He would indeed be the worthy son of the scientific age. And yet I fear that in a scientific age he would possibly be misunderstood, and even suffer from lack of sympathy. I fear that he would, in fact, be in practice an opponent of all that he desired to uphold. He would be a worse enemy of machinery than any Luddite smashing machines. He would obstruct the activities of the telephone exchange by praising the beauties of the telephone, more than if he had sat down like a more normal and traditional poet, to tell all those bustling business people about the beauties of a wayside flower. It would, of course, be the same with any adventure of the same luckless admiration. If a philosopher, when taken for the first time for a ride in a motor car, were to fall into such an enthusiasm for the marvel that he insisted on understanding the whole of the mechanism on the spot, it is probable that he would have got to his destination rather quicker if he had walked. If he were, in his simple zeal to insist on the machine being taken to pieces in the road, that he might rejoice in the inmost secrets of its structure, he might even lose his popularity with the garage taxi driver or chauffeur. Now, we have all known children, for instance, who did really, in this fashion, want to see wheels go round, but though their attitude may bring them nearest to the kingdom of heaven, it does not necessarily bring them nearer to the end of the journey. They are admiring motors, but they are not motoring, that is, they are not necessarily moving. They are not serving that purpose which motoring was meant to serve. Now, as a matter of fact, this contradiction has ended in a congestion, in a sort of stagnant state of the spirit, in which there is rather less real appreciation of the marvels of man's invention than if the poet confined himself to making a penny whistle on which to pipe in the woods of Arcadia, or the child confined himself to making a toy bow or a catapult. The child really is happy with a beautiful happiness every time he lets fly an arrow. It is by no means certain that the businessman is happy with a beautiful happiness every time he sends off a telegram. The very name of a telegram is a poem, even more magical than the arrow, for it means a dart, and a dart that writes. Think what the child would feel if he could shoot a pencil arrow that drew a picture at the other end of the valley or the long street. Yet the businessman but seldom dances and claps his hands for joy at the thought of this, whenever he sends a telegram. Now, this has a considerable relevancy to the real criticism of the modern mechanical civilization. Its supporters are always telling us of its marvelous inventions, in proving that they are marvelous improvements. But it is highly doubtful whether they really feel them as improvements. For instance, I have heard it said 100 times that glass is an excellent illustration of the way in which something becomes a convenience for everybody. Look at glass in windows, they say. That has been turned into a mere necessity, yet that also was once a luxury. And I always feel disposed to answer, yes, and it would be better for people like you if it was still a luxury, if that would induce you to look at it, and not only to look through it. Do you ever consider how magical a thing is that invisible film standing between you and the birds and the wind? Do you ever think of it as water hung in the air, or a flattened diamond too clear to be even valued? Do you ever feel a window as a sudden opening in a wall? And if you do not, what is the good of glass to you? This may be a little exaggerated in the heat of the moment, but it is really true that in these things invention outstrips imagination. Humanity has not got the good out of its own inventions, and by making more and more inventions, it is only leaving its own power of happiness further and further behind. I remarked, in an earlier part of this particular meditation, that machinery was not necessarily evil, and that there were some who valued it in the right spirit, but that most of those who had to do with it never had a chance of valuing it at all. A poet might enjoy a clock as a child enjoys a music box, but the actual clerk who looks at the actual clock to see that he is just in time to catch the train for the city is no more enjoying machinery than he is enjoying music. There may be something to be said for mechanical toys, but modern society is a mechanism and not a toy. The child indeed is a good test in these matters, and illustrates both the fact that there is an interest in machinery, and the fact that machinery itself generally prevents us from being interested. It is almost a proverb that every little boy wants to be an engine driver, but machinery has not multiplied the number of engine drivers so as to allow all little boys to drive engines. It has not given each little boy a real engine, as his family might give him a toy engine. The effect of railways on a population cannot be to produce a population of engine drivers. It can only produce a population of passengers, and of passengers a little too like packages. In other words, its only effect on the visionary or potential engine driver is to put him inside the train, where he cannot see the engine, instead of outside the train, where he can. And though he grows up to the greatest and most glorious success in life, and swindles the widow and orphan till he can travel in a first-class carriage specially reserved, with a permanent pass to the International Congress of Cosmopolitan World Peace for wire pullers, he will never, perhaps, enjoy a railway train again. He will never even see a railway train again, as he saw it when he stood as a ragged urchin and waved wildly from the grassy banks at the passage of the Scotch Express. We may transfer the parable from engine drivers to engineers. It may be that the driver of the Scotch Express hurls himself forward in a fury of speed because his heart is in the Highlands, his heart is not here. That he spurns the border behind him with a gesture and hails the Grampians before him with a cheer. And whether or no it is true that the engine driver's heart is in the Highlands, it is sometimes true that the little boy's heart is in the engine. But it is by no means true that passengers as a whole, travelling behind engines as a whole, enjoy the speed in a positive sense, though they may approve of it in a negative sense. I mean that they wish to travel swiftly, not because swift travelling is enjoyable, but because it is not enjoyable. They want it rushed through, not because being behind the railway engine is a rapture, but because being in the railway carriage is a bore. In the same way, if we consider the joy of engineers, we must remember that there is only one joyful engineer to 1,000 bored victims of engineering. The discussion that raged between Mr. Penty and others at one time threatened to resolve itself into a feud between engineers and architects. But when the engineer asks us to forget all the monotony and materialism of a mechanical age because his own science has some of the inspiration of an art, the architect may well be ready with a reply. For this is very much as if architects were never engaged in anything but the building of prisons and lunatic asylums. It is as if they had told us proudly with what passionate and poetical enthusiasm they had themselves reared towers high enough for the hanging of Haman, or dug dungeons impenetrable enough for the starving of Ungolino. Now I have already explained that I do not propose anything in what some call the practical way, but should rather be called the immediate way, beyond the better distribution of the ownership of such machines as are really found to be necessary. But when we come to the larger question of machinery in a fundamentally different sort of society, governed by our philosophy and religion, there is a great deal more to be said. The best and shortest way of saying it is that instead of the machine being a giant to which the man is a pygmy, we must at least reverse the proportions until man is a giant to whom the machine is a toy. Granted that idea, and we have no reason to deny that it might be a legitimate and enlivening toy. In that sense it would not matter if every child were an engine driver, or better still, every engine driver a child. But those who are always taunting us with unpracticality will at least admit that this is not practical. I have thus tried to put myself fairly in the position of the enthusiast, as we should always do in judging of enthusiasms. And I think it will be agreed that even after the experiment a real difference between the engineering enthusiasms and older enthusiasms remains as a fact of common sense. Admitting that the man who designs a steam engine is as original as the man who designs a statue, There is an immediate and immense difference in the effects of what they design. The original statue is a joy to the sculptor, but it is also, in some degree, when it is not too original, a joy to the people who see the statue. Or at any rate, it is meant to be a joy to other people seeing it, or there would be no point in letting it be seen. But though the engine may be a great joy to the engineer, and of great use to the other people, it is not, and it is not meant to be, in the same sense, a great joy to the other people. Nor is this because of a deficiency in education, as some of the artists might allege in the case of art. It is involved in the very nature of machinery, which, when once it is established, consists of repetitions and not of variations and surprises. A man can see something in the limbs of a statue which he never saw before. They may seem to toss or sweep as they never did before. But he would not only be astonished but alarmed if the wheels of the steam engine began to behave as they never did before. We may take it, therefore, as an essential and not an accidental character of machinery, that it is an inspiration for the inventor, but merely a monotony for the consumer. This being so, it seems to me that in an ideal state, engineering would be the exception, just as the delight in engines is the exception. As it is, engineering and engines are the rule, and are even a grinding and oppressive rule. The lifelessness which the machine imposes on the masses is an infinitely bigger and more obvious fact than the individual interest of the man who makes machines. Having reached this point in the argument, we may well compare it with what may be called the practical aspect of the problem of machinery. Now, it seems to me obvious that machinery, as it exists today, has gone almost as much beyond its practical sphere as it has beyond its imaginative sphere. The whole of industrial society is founded on the notion that the quickest and cheapest thing is to carry coals to Newcastle, even if it be only with the object of afterwards carrying them from Newcastle. It is founded on the idea that rapid and regular transit and transport, perpetual interchange of goods and incessant communication between remote places is of all things the most economical and direct. But it is not true that the quickest and cheapest thing for a man who has just pulled an apple from an apple tree is to send it in a consignment of apples on a train that goes like a thunderbolt to a market at the other end of England. The quickest and cheapest thing for a man who has pulled a fruit from a tree is to put it in his mouth. He is the supreme economist who wastes no money on railway journeys. He is the absolute type of efficiency who is far too efficient to go in for organization. And though he is, of course, an extreme and ideal case of simplification, the case for simplification does stand as solid as an apple tree. Insofar as men can produce their own goods on the spot, they are saving the community a vast expenditure which is quite often out of proportion to the return. Insofar as we can establish a considerable proportion of simple and self-supporting people, we are relieving the pressure of what is often a wasteful as well as a harassing process. In taking this as a general outline of the reform, it does appear true that a simpler life in large areas of the community might leave machinery more or less as an exceptional thing, as it may well be to the exceptional man who really puts his soul into it. There are difficulties in this view, but for the moment I may well take as an illustration the parallel of the particular sort of modern engineering which moderns are very fond of denouncing. They often forget that most of their praise of scientific instruments applies most vividly to scientific weapons. If we are to have so much pity for the unhappy genius who has just invented a new galvanometer, what about the poor genius who has just invented a new gun? If there is a real imaginative inspiration in the making of a steam engine, is there not imaginative interest in the making of a submarine? Yet many modern admirers of science would be very anxious to abolish these machines altogether, even in the very act of telling us that we cannot abolish machines at all. As I believe in the right of national self-defense, I would not abolish them altogether, but I think they may give us a hint of how exceptional things may be treated exceptionally. For the moment I will leave the progressive to laugh at my absurd notion of a limitation of machines, and go off to a meeting to demand the limitation of armaments.